Hi, this is Maria Williams. I'm excited to share this card with you today. I made it with Altenews Ruffled Flowers, Stamps, and Dies. I love how the colors go together, and most of all, I love that when you open the card, you are surprised by a pop-up bouquet of flowers. To start off, let me give you a quick look at the stamp set from Altenews. As you can see, it has outline stamps, and then it has two different layers for the flowers and for the leaves. The stamp set comes with a layering guide on the back of this small brochure, and you also get several projects and instructions and the colors that were used for each of the projects, which I think is a really great starting point when you get your stamp set. And everything is really well specified, except that I had a little bit of trouble with the little bits and pieces for the leaves. I went ahead and wrote down the letter and number combinations for each of the pieces because some of them are pretty small. And I'll have a picture of this on my blog so that you don't have as much trouble as I did. But as you can see, here's some of the really small pieces. So when you're trying to identify what it goes with, you really have to take a look at the layering guide to figure out what pieces go where. So if you want a little bit of help, like I said, I'll have a picture of this on my blog. I have already stamped the outline images multiple times. I did use my MISTI just in case. I set up both of the outline stamps in the MISTI at one time, and then I cut some pieces of white cardstock to size. I used Whisper white cardstock from Stampin' Up, and originally I had used Memento, but then I decided I wanted a lighter color for the outline, so I used the Distress Oxide ink in Hickory Smoke and stamped 3 sets of outlines. I used 2 different mini ink cube sets from Altenews. I used Deep Blue Seas and Green Fields, and these are fast drying dye inks, and they go on a little bit splotchy, but then they even out. I really don't understand how that happens, but it really is true. I'm going to stamp the lighter layer first, so I'm looking at the stamp set and picking out the first color layer that has the most surface area, and I'm going to set both of them up at the same time in my MISTI. I make sure that my piece of cardstock that I've already stamped the outlines on is all the way pushed into the lower right hand corner of my MISTI, and I secure it with a large magnet. And then I'm going to get right on top of those stamps and make sure that they are perfectly lined up with the stamped images. Then I'm going to take the lightest blue ink from my set, which is Seabreeze, and I'm going to ink up my stamps really well, and then just go ahead and stamp. I'm going to repeat this process for all 3 of my stamped pieces of cardstock, and then I'm going to move on to the second layer of color. And you can see that I'm getting really good coverage just with one stamping. I don't need to double stamp or anything. I just get really nice results just with one stamp. Here I am setting up the stamps for the second colored layer on top of the first colored layer, and then I'm going to close my MISTI door and ink up the stamps and stamp one at a time the 3 panels. The color that I'm using to stamp the second color layer is the second lightest color in the set, which is called Turquoise. I really love the way these flowers turn out, and I think that Altenews really has a great thing going with these ink sets. It just makes it so easy to layer the different colors with the color families the way they come. Of course, you don't have to use inks to color these flowers. You could always use Copic markers or colored pencils or whatever you like best. And I do have a couple of cards that I will share at a later date on my blog that I colored with Copics, but it was definitely a lot more time consuming. Once I'm finished stamping the flowers, I'm moving on to stamping the leaves, and I had already used a stamp set before, and what I decided to do was to take all the small stamps that go with each one of the flower clusters and arrange them all onto one block. So whatever layer I'm going to do with the lighter ink, I'll go on one block, and then the second layer that's going to be the darker color goes on a separate block. Since I had done this about a week or maybe a week and a half or two ago, I did have to check the layering chart because I really couldn't remember which bits and pieces went with what cluster. But once I figured that out, I was set to go, and it really wasn't hard to do. I could have used my Misty for this, but I thought that it would be just as easy to go ahead and stamp this freehand, and I could have done the same thing with the layers of the flowers, but I don't know, because it was a larger surface, I didn't want to take the chance, but I'm stamping the leaves freehand. I have inked up the leaves for my first layer, and I'm stamping off onto just some scrap paper, which is actually an envelope from mail that I had laying around for recycling. And once I've stamped it off, I feel confident that I'm going to get a good impression, so I'm making it up again and stamping my first layer. I did edit out my head, which was right above the stamps again, just to make sure that I get everything nicely lined up. To keep things simple and not mix up my ink colors and my stamps, I am going to stamp all three panels one after the other with this particular stamp, and then I'm going to switch over to the darker shade for this particular flower cluster. The first shade of green I used was called Frayed Leaf, and again it's the lightest color in that set, and the color that I'm using for the second layer is called Forest Glades. And I'm giving you the ink names just in case you want to buy the colors individually, which you can also do. Once again, I stamped all of these small details one after the other on that same leaf cluster, and then I moved on to the second flower cluster, and you don't need to see that. It's exactly the same thing. I started out with a lighter shade of green, stamped all three flower clusters, and then did the second layer. With all my flowers and leaves stamped, I moved on to die cutting. I carefully aligned the dies with each one of the flower clusters. There's two of them, of course, and I secured them with a little bit of post-it tape. And because I used the Misty to stamp the first few layers of the flowers, they're all exactly in the same place. So what I'm going to do to save some time is I'm going to line up two of the stamped panels and attach them with a little bit of tape. It's removable tape, and I'm going to run them through my die cutting machine at the same time. As you can see, these die cut perfectly, but I was using Whisper White cardstock from Stampin' Up, which is not as thick as some of the other 80-pound cardstocks out there. If, for example, you were using 80-pound Nina Solar White, you might want to do some die cutting just on some scrap pieces of paper, or of cardstock, just to see if it would die cut okay. But if you're using a thinner cardstock like I'm using here, you shouldn't have any problems at all. I die cut my remaining two clusters from the remaining panel, and then I moved on to the inside of the card. When I was trying to choose a paper for the actual bouquet, the paper that would be wrapped around the flowers, I remembered that amongst that pile of recycling that I had sitting next to my desk was an envelope that had a black and white pattern on the inside, and I didn't want to create too much bulk inside of the card, so I thought that I would just do a different kind of recycling and use the envelope for the bouquet wrapper. So I just trimmed a piece of the envelope out, and then there was a little bit of a kind of like a V in the middle of it, and so I folded right along that, and then I just eyeballed a triangle that would be about the size of the bouquet that I wanted on the inside, and allowed about an extra, I would say somewhere between 1/4 of an inch and 1/2 an inch for flaps, because you need to have a way to glue this bouquet into the center of the card. And this will make a lot more sense in a moment. So I just cut that out, and then I took my mini scoreboard and scored the line where I wanted to create my flaps. Then I folded along those lines and also trimmed off some of the flap that I thought might show when I placed it in the card, and then took my die cuts and started arranging my flowers. In some cases, I needed to trim off some of the pieces of the clusters of flowers so that they wouldn't create a problem when opening and closing the card. So this is the main thing that you need to look out for. They can overlap a little bit, but you have to make sure that when you close the card that the edges of the flower clusters are not going to need to be folded. So they just need to barely come to touching the card, and then you have to make sure that they're not going to get tangled in the middle where they come together. I did end up trimming what I'm calling the bouquet wrapper down a little bit, and then I used some score tape on the flaps so that I would have a really strong bond with the card, and with the opening and closing it wouldn't come apart. And I could have attached the flower clusters at this point, but again, this was sort of a trial and error kind of process that I was following, so I thought that I would attach the bouquet wrapper first and then attach the flowers. So basically what you would do here is you would line up the center line of the bouquet wrapper with the center line of your card. I ended up not doing that, but that's totally what I recommend. So attach one side, then fold the bouquet wrapper in half, and then close the card onto it. This is the safest way to do it to make sure that your card closes properly. To add a little bit of more depth to my bouquet, I'm attaching one of the flower clusters directly to my card base. So I've put it on my scoreboard and scored pretty much down the center of this cluster and folded it. I did cut off the little bit of the stem that I thought would just be awkward and create extra bulk. And then I'm using some multimedia matte to add a little bit of adhesive to one side of the flower cluster, and I'm going to place that in the center of the card and glue that down, and then make sure that my card is going to close properly. And then I'm going to add glue to the other side and then close my card onto it. Then I will take the remaining two flower clusters and arrange them so that again, so that they don't interfere with opening and closing the card, and they also don't interfere with each other, and use multimedia matte to attach them to the bouquet wrapper. So of course I have to put the adhesive on the stamped part of the cluster and then attach it to the inside of the bouquet wrapper. Now, word of caution, this paper that I use from my envelope was pretty thin, and so when I added the first cluster with the multimedia matte, I did notice that the paper did warp a little bit because of the moisture of the glue. So when I put the glue onto my second cluster, instead of having kind of blobs of adhesive, I went ahead and smoothed it around with my finger, and that seemed to make a difference. So either just spread your glue instead of having dots of it, or you could use a thicker paper that wouldn't be so susceptible to warping with the glue. So after I had applied the glue to my second cluster, which I did have to trim a little bit here and there, I placed it inside the bouquet wrapper, and I opened and closed my card a few times before the glue was totally dry, just to make sure that everything was working properly. And then the inside of the card I thought was done. I hadn't done my sentiment, and I will do that in a moment. But first I'm going to work on the front of the card. So I'm trimming a piece of smoky slate Stampin' Up! Cardstock to 5 1/4 by 4, and that is going to go right onto the card base eventually. And I also have a stitch rectangle die that I have trimmed, that I have die cut out of some Whisper White cardstock. And I have chosen a couple of sentiments from the My Favorite Thing stamp set called Handwritten Happiness. I'm going to use the Happy Birthday, which I've already removed from the stamp set packaging, and place it on a large block. And I'm going to use the third color from the Deep Blue Seas mini ink cube set. And I even though I didn't use that for the flowers, I thought that for the sentiment, since it's a fairly dainty sentiment, I thought that the sentiment would show up better if I used a darker ink. So I'm inking it up really, really well, and for a little something different, I'm going to stamp it on the diagonal. And I did make a little bit of a boo-boo here because I should have stamped off on a piece of scrap paper and then re-inked it and stamped it onto my cardstock, but I was thinking that the ink was going to even out a little bit, and it didn't, because the stamp just wasn't accepting the ink well enough. I should have either put some Versamark on it or stamped it off and inked it up again. But anyway, my sentiment just ended up being not as crisp as it could have been, but I didn't know it was going to end up like that, so I just kept going. So to attach the clusters to my front panel, I'm going to use some foam tape, and I did use quite a bit of it because I wanted to make sure that the flowers wouldn't get bent or damaged in any way. I just wanted to make sure they were pretty well glued down. So I didn't use an excessive amount, but I did use quite a bit. I set my die cuts aside for a moment and started assembling the front of the card. So first I placed the smoky slate panel that I had cut out earlier, and then once again using my ATG gun, I attached the stamped panel to the front of the card, and then I peeled off all those little backer papers from the foam tape and attached my flower clusters to the front of the card. You'll notice that the leaves from the flower clusters are extending beyond the center white panel of the card, and I did this totally on purpose. I think sometimes it looks better when your die cuts extend a little bit beyond the center of the card. It makes the whole card look like one unit rather than all these different blocks on the front of your card. At this point, the card could be complete, but I wanted to add some finishing touches. So the first thing I did was that I added some Nuvo glitter gloss pen to the blue areas of the flowers. I didn't do it on the leaves, and I didn't do it on the white areas of the flowers. And then because I thought there was a little bit too much white space, I looked through my embellishments and found some enamel dots that are from a long time ago from Stampin' Up. They were in my stash, and I'm sorry, but I can't tell you exactly what color they were, but they did match the card perfectly. And so I used 6 of those, and then to add just one more touch to the centers of the flowers, I took some silver stickles and added small dots to the center of each one of the flowers. It's always a good idea when you're using stickles or Nuvo drops or anything like that that you have to squeeze out of a tube to test it out first. Sometimes you might get a little bit of an air bubble, and if you are holding it right over your project and you squeeze, it might just spray all over. So make sure that before you use it, each time before you use it, that you test it out first on a scratch piece of paper or cardstock. So it was really at this point in the card making process that I realized I needed to put a sentiment, or that I would like a sentiment, on the inside of the card. And as you can see, I was having a little difficulty figuring out how to pick up the stamp without ruining the bouquet of flowers, but in the end it wasn't so bad. And then once again I used the Tide Blue ink from the Mini Ink Cube set to ink up my stamp, and having realized that I didn't get a great impression on the front of the card, I did grab a piece of scratch paper once again and stamped off, and then re-inked the stamp and stamped it onto the inside of my card. I did not add any Nuvo glitter pen to the inside flowers of the card, but I did take the stickles and add small dots in the centers of the flowers, and when I was done with that, my card was finally finished. I really love this stamp set, but if you don't have it and you want to make a similar bouquet, I encourage you to look through all your flower stamp sets and see how you could incorporate them into a bouquet on the inside of your card. Well, that's it for today's video. I hope you have enjoyed it. If you did, I would really appreciate a thumbs up. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day. For links to the products I used and still shots, please visit my blog at mariascardsandmore.com.